On this episode of Whack-a-Doodle, is that women always lose in your courtroom. Mere sock puppet that exists only to enrich yourselves. She didn't think that this takeover/handoff was handled appropriately or legally, would be wrongful, and would expose her to potential liability. Thus, you are a liar and not a very good one. Excuse me? For a non-profit? And, fracking. Welcome to Whack-a-Doodle. Today we'll go into an ongoing case, which is the other case that was mentioned in the Dragon Curve trial. And this one's all about sexism. It is still in progress, but there's some interesting things here that parallel to the Dragon Curve case, though this time Michelle Page is the plaintiff, so she's the one that's bringing the lawsuit. And I'm just going to refer to her as Paige in this episode, since it's mostly talking about her. So to summarize this case, just so you have an idea of where we're going, because shockingly, the case is confusing, Michelle Page says she worked at a not-for-profit company called DBNA, or Digital Business Networks Alliance, and they did not pay her. They took her off of the board/management position, and they paid another guy to do the same job that she was doing. They were also paying other people while she worked there, but they were not paying her. She also claimed defamation based on some emails that were sent. And finally, the complaint says, quote, "You," meaning DBNA, "are operating a corrupt enterprise whereby a nominal nonprofit's resources are illegally diverted to yourselves, reducing DBNA to a mere sock puppet that exists only to enrich yourselves," which is a very strong statement. And in this case, Michelle Page is seeking $2 million from this nonprofit. So anyway, let's get started. Chapter 1, B2B or not B2B. So the defendants, who are the people being sued here, there are a few of them. There's DBNA, the nonprofit company I just mentioned, OFS Portal, which is a kind of a related company. We'll get into it in a second. McGinnis Lockridge, who is the law firm for DBNA, and Philip Schmant, who worked for DBNA, and he was actually paid by them. So what does DBNA do? According to their website, currently, the B2B payments industry in the United States is severely challenged by inefficient and costly manual processes. That's why the DBN Alliance, with support from various industry bodies, has recently launched its own open exchange network. This network enables a secure and efficient exchange of B2B invoices and e-documents for companies in the United States. Their next LinkedIn post is going to be, "What my lawsuits taught me about B2B sales." So some of the companies who participated in DBNA include some pretty big names like Chevron, Microsoft, and Halliburton, which has a lot of scandals if you're not super familiar, including the big oil spills, some asbestos, a lot of lawsuits over employee pay, and fracking. So if it were me, I personally would not put their name on the front page of my nonprofit's website, but to each their own. So moving on to the other defendant, OFS Portal. This is a little bit stranger to me why they're actually named as the defendant on this case. The only connection that I can see is that the president/board members of DBNA were also working at OFS Portal. I'm still not sure how that gives Page the right to sue them, but OFS Portal describes their company as oil and gas e-commerce. They engage suppliers, operators, and procurement platforms in implementing a common interoperability model that includes enforcement of proper data protection and sovereignty, as well as the use of open industry standards in a cost-effective manner. So it seems like they do something similar to DBNA, but just with oil and gas stuff. OFS Portal has 4 members, including Halliburton. So that's weird. This seems like a whole mess to me, but maybe this is just what networking does. I don't know. I don't have an MBA. So the last two defendants are the law firm McGinnis and Schmant, who is just a person, because they were paid while Paige was working there. She says she's entitled to the funds that DB&A paid to them. I don't know how that makes sense that they're defendants. To me, it would be like the company or the president or the owner who decides who to pay and who should be liable for paying people back. Like, not, you'd take it from the company, not from the people's pockets who were paid. That doesn't make sense to me. So my thoughts to start off with, to me, this is an odd action to take, just suing them in general. If she wants to stay and keep working in this digital B2B space, she's wrecked all of the goodwill and like network that she had with these people. And there are some really big names associated with it that really could have been good connections from what I assume. Also, if I were her, I'd sue Halliburton instead. $2 million is like nothing compared to their other lawsuits. Like, they may not even notice what's going on. One final note before we get into the details. This case is still kind of in progress. The only big thing discussed so far is jurisdiction. So that is where the case should actually be tried. So I'll skip the boring parts of that. We just need to know that Paige wants it tried in New York and the defendants do not. I don't know the rationale for either. It may just be trying to bog everyone down in litigation. It may be that some states are more favorable to employers or employees. I don't know. But anyway, that's all you need to know to understand the rest of this episode. Chapter 2, the accusations. So starting off, this is what Michelle Page alleges happened. So Michelle Page did start doing work at DB&A. We do not know when. In September 2022, she made a draft model for the oversight entity, which she says is the budget, and she sent it to Jim Taylor, who at the time was the interim president of DB&A. So she did some work in September 2022, and then 6 months later, in April 2023, she emailed Taylor, who is this same interim president, and she, quote, lamented her ability to attain a board seat. The next day, she emailed someone else applying to be president and treasurer. And then 2 days later, she emailed again to apply to be treasurer or secretary. So then 2 days after that email, they elected her to be treasurer and secretary. She verbally accepted via telephone. At this position, according to her, she created DB&A's financial plan, managed its finances, collected its initial membership fees, and participated in all of its planning and development efforts. She says she devoted at least 500 hours to DB&A's business. She also says she was never paid, which to me would not be so surprising at a nonprofit. I wouldn't think that I would get a huge paycheck for that. Also, it's weird that the filing says she accepted via telephone. To me, that implies we maybe, once again, don't have a written contract. She said that in conversations with Taylor, who is that former interim president, and Chris Welsh, who is the DB&A board chairman and the OFS CEO at this time, she stated and believed that they had agreed that she would be paid her market wages whenever DB&A had the budget to do so. But these are just conversations, which are obviously hard to prove in court. She said that the 2022 budget she made included a salary for her, but the document she submitted to the court was allegedly too small to read and confirm if that was true or not. Also, from my personal opinion, if she made it and wrote herself in to get paid, I don't think that counts. Also, if it's just a draft and not accepted, then how is that legally binding? So then in early May 2023, which is just a few weeks later after she'd accepted via telephone, she exchanged emails with Taylor and Welsh regarding her signing DB&A's bylaws, which is maybe a kind of a contract. That's what it seems like. According to the filings, Schmant, who was the only human defendant and non-company defendant listed in the lawsuit, it said he occasionally acted as secretary during DB&A board meetings, including April 23rd, which is okay. She had just been elected, so maybe she didn't know the process yet. And also May 16th, even though she was there at the meeting. So she was there at these meetings, but Schmant was still acting as secretary for some reason. And for this, Schmant was paid $570 an hour for work related to DB&A. which, excuse me, for a non-profit, you are making $570 an hour? Rich people are ridiculous. You should not call yourself a nonprofit if someone is making $570 an hour. And to do what? Take notes during meetings? I mean, I don't know. I'm just assuming. But still though, this is crazy behavior. Capitalism is evil. Anyway, they also hired the law firm Magna as counsel during that time and presumably paid them. We are not sure how much. And so that is why Schmandt and McGinnis are listed as defendants in this case. So we're going to fast forward 6 months later to October 2023. DB&A put in a request for proposal or pitch to its members to see if they would like to quote to provide shared service management to DB&A. So to me, I think this means they're kind of putting out a call to see who is going to run the computer and tech side of things. They're going to use an existing company or an existing platform. It's wild to me that they don't have that yet and somebody is making $570 an hour. Why did you start the company and start doing all this stuff if you don't have any actual product? Seems cart before the horse to me. It's also weird that they only put it out to its own members, because it's kind of like they're just paying money to themselves. I know at the company I work for, if we award business, we have to be fair and we can't just hire people that we know. I have to do training every year that says that, and I don't even make decisions about contracts or the business. So I don't know how this is allowed, but whatever. This is a different world. So anyway, Di-Fi, which is Paige and Eden's company from episode 1, sent in a proposal, but it was not selected. And I can't imagine why. So we're going to fast forward 3 months later to January 2024. A woman named Mimi Stansbury emailed Paige and requested information regarding DB&A's bank account and requested to get her access. And at this time, Stansbury says she is the treasurer and not Paige. So who is Mimi Stansbury? Mimi Stansbury seems to be an employee of the OFS portal. And if you'll remember, the DB&A board chair is also from OFS, and OFS is a defendant in the case. So then a few days later, we're still in January 2024, the board voted to remove all prior officers, who at the time just seemed to include Paige and Taylor. And they appointed Welsh as president and COO, and Stansbury as treasurer and secretary. So we're keeping track of all these different companies. Welsh is the president, COO, and board chairman of DB&A, and he's the CEO of OFS. Stansbury is now the treasurer and secretary of DB&A, and then a few months after this, she was appointed OFS CEO, taking over from Welsh. So maybe this is why OFS is being sued, because Paige thinks it's like a hostile takeover of DB&A. I don't know. It's all very confusing. But regardless, it seems like this change made some people unhappy, or at the very least, made Michelle Paige unhappy, which is probably fair. So the next day, after they removed all of the officers, Paige emailed Welsh, who is the board chairman, president, all these different things. And Paige said she didn't think that this takeover/handoff was handled appropriately or legally, that she certainly didn't intend to volunteer so many hours without compensation, and that everyone understood that we would be compensated fairly and reasonably as soon as DB&A launched its operations, and that she was particularly troubled that DB&A saw fit to pay its general counsel, but not her, the treasurer and secretary. So from my reading of the bylaws, though, the secretary should have been a paid position, but not the treasurer. And I'm also not sure how much secretarying she did, since it mentioned that Schmandt covered some of the board meetings and he was paid for that. So maybe there was something weird here. Maybe she was elected but didn't do work as the secretary. Maybe there was no paperwork to show she was actually elected. Or maybe she did really intend to get paid, but the change in staffing messed that up. I have no idea. It's very difficult to tell. But one thought I had was that if this really wasn't handled legally, then why didn't Taylor join her in this lawsuit? So I don't know. That's just my speculation. So about a week after this takeover, Stansbury, who is the new treasurer, again emailed and asked for the bank info for DBNA. And then about a week after that, Schmant, who was the previously paid person and also a defendant in the suit, emailed Page and said that as a former officer of DBNA and a signatory on the DBNA bank account, Page had a continuing duty to protect the assets of DBNA, and under no circumstances may she use those assets for personal benefit. Her attempt to withdraw funds or using her status as signatory on the account as a means to leverage her personal position or extract concessions from DBNA would be wrongful and would expose her to potential liability to DBNA. And so this email is why Page is suing them from defamation. It's interesting to me. The email doesn't say that she did or didn't do any of that. It's just kind of a warning. But it is not good that he felt the need to warn her. I wonder if they found what happened in the Lerner case and were afraid she was going to try to do the same to them. It's also in general not good that she won't give them bank account access. Why would you do that? That can't be legal, right? And why did no one else have access besides her? You would think at least the president would also have access. I don't know. That's odd to me. But what isn't odd in these cases? So we're going to go 2 months later to March 2024. And this is when Page started the lawsuits. And if you're trying to keep track of the timelines, this was after Duzik sued them, but before the Duzik Dragon Curve trial actually got started. And an interesting footnote here, Michelle Page was represented by Christopher Page, her husband, at the beginning. But at one point she said he isn't going to represent her anymore because of his health. So she's technically going pro se and representing herself. The court says in response to this, the court takes Page at her word, but notes the strong similarity in tone and style between filings after he left and prior communications from Christopher Page. If you remember the last episode, this isn't the first time they've written emails signed as the other. I don't know why this matters or why she would lie about it, but whatever. I'll take her at her word as well. Chapter 3. The case so far. So as I mentioned before, this case didn't really get out of the question of jurisdiction. It looks like Page tried to sue in New York, but no one involved is in New York anymore. Not even her. She's in Florida now. So the judge in March 2025 dismissed the case from the New York court, saying that they didn't have jurisdiction. And Page keeps pushing back for various reasons. So I don't want to go into the court statements too much because they're pretty dry, but this is interesting. Page said in a few different places in some of her replies to the court that upon information and belief, DBNA has repeatedly transacted business in New York. So the judge says, although allegations based upon information and belief are not necessarily factually deficient, the words, however, are not magic. A plaintiff cannot plop upon information and belief in front of a conclusory allegation and thereby render it non-conclusory. He also says the plaintiff has only lobbed conclusory assertions. So here, just throwing out that plopped and lobbed are words with very heavy connotations. To me, it sounds like the judge is getting very frustrated with their behavior. But anyway, officially, the judge did dismiss the case because of jurisdictional issues in March of 2025. But the fun isn't over yet. Chapter 4. Putting the dis in disqualify. So then, about 6 months and many court filings later, in the fall of 2025, Page starts sending motions to disqualify the judge in the case. And so far, there are 10 motions. And the letters that I could access were a doozy. Honestly, after reading through all these dry court filings about jurisdiction in this, it is actually a very nice reprieve to read their Whack-a-Doodle letters. So first we have a letter from September 2025 from Page to the judge. And it starts, even if we were to assume that all of your decisions in this case have been 100% correct, you must be recused. So we are starting off with a hard swing. It continues. Strangely, however, you continue to insist, contrary to all evidence, that my motions to recuse are based upon some unspecified disagreement with your decisions. Strange indeed. And once again, we do not have correct use of M dashes, so this is probably not ChatGPT. Page then brings up a different prior case that the judge had ruled on. And again, we don't need to know all of the details of this prior case, but essentially, Page says, thus, between Johnson and my case, you have held that a woman cannot sue her individual employer in the state to which she was involuntarily transferred, and that a woman cannot sue her corporate employer in the state in which she began working at her own home or business. In other words, the only commonality between these two cases is that women always lose in your courtroom. And the women always lose in your courtroom is bold and italics, so we know they mean business. That, at the very least, creates the appearance of gender animus, and the mere appearance of impropriety is all that's required for a recusal. So I interpret this to mean that the judge dismissed a kind of similar case. So continuing on. Quite simply, the facts of these two cases, Johnson and my case, are so wildly dissimilar that it's difficult to imagine how or why anyone would think that your ruling in Johnson controls here. But it's you, not I, who insists that your prior ruling in Johnson controls your ruling in this case. Thus, the fact that the plaintiff's gender is the only common fact in both cases is alarming. And I don't know enough about law to know if this makes sense or not. They continue. Although you and I have our disagreements, I would love to know more about that. I would love to know more about their disagreements. They say, I have done everything in my power to comply with both the letter and the spirit of your rulings and individual rules. I don't know if I believe that, based on the other cases, and the Yale Law degree. Consequently, I respectfully submit that I need briefing to fully document my allegation, but to the extent that I must present my argument via letter rather than written motion, I have. So it seems like the judge is saying that he already dismissed the case, so stop contacting me, and they kept writing these letters and motions. Similar to the post-trial memo that was not allowed in the Dragon Curve case, but they did it anyway. But once again, I will say, they did say respectfully, so maybe it's fine. They continue. The standard here is that you must demonstrate that no reasonable person would doubt your impartiality after reading both of your decisions. And quite simply, that's impossible. Even assuming arguendo that you have some explanation for your decisions, it's too little, too late. Even as a matter of judicial economy, your continued presence in this case is a needless waste of judicial resources. Where have I heard that before? It's almost unimaginable that we're 173 filings, 18 months, and 2 Second Circuit matters into this case without any discovery or even an answer because you are simply unwilling or unable to explain the obvious contradiction that I first pointed out more than 6 months ago. But here we are. Here we are indeed. And I have a funny feeling that the 173 filings aren't the fault of the judge, but I don't know. Quite simply, why should I be able to sue these defendants in Florida, a state to which they claim to have even fewer and less substantial ties than New York, if I can't sue them in New York? So I'm not a lawyer, but I'd guess it's because the Pages live in Florida and no one involved is in New York anymore. And if I can't sue them in either New York or Florida, then what state has specific jurisdiction over this case? Once again, I am not an expert, but I guess Texas or Delaware, where the companies have offices or where they were registered. But what do I know? Your steadfast inability and failure to answer, requires your recusal, regardless of the merits of your decisions. Therefore, the issue in this motion and in this case is not whether or not you got it right. The issue is whether or not you should continue to participate in this case, given your apparent bias against women that you either cannot or will not explain or justify, and that I demonstrated through your statements and actions in matters outside of this case, namely, your opinion in a prior unrelated case. They didn't cite the case. I assume it's the Johnson case that they talked about before. But once again, it says it's respectfully submitted, so that's nice. And this recusal was denied by the judge. I'm really curious. Is it like a slap in the face to the judge to ask for a recusal? Like, is it super rude? I feel like if I were the judge on this case, I would just say, like, go, sure, whatever, go ahead, get him away from me. I'm tired. Make him somebody else's problem. So we have another letter from December 2025, and it says, as this case enters its third year after a 21-page docket filled with 181 court filings, without making any progress whatsoever on anything, and with a key witness apparently dead or otherwise unavailable. I have no idea what they're talking about here. Who's dead or otherwise unavailable? I don't know, guys. This is some wild stuff going on. And with most documents lost, as most emails were stored on third-party email accounts. So the wording is confusing here, even to me. Overall, it seems like some things were deleted. Some email evidence is gone. So they may be screwed in trying to submit this suit elsewhere in a different state. So yeah, sure sucks to have evidence deleted during a lawsuit, huh? Who would do something like that? They continue with the question, what in the world are you doing? And in return, I ask, what are you doing talking to a judge like that? Like, what do you hope to accomplish? I file motion after motion for discovery, and I'm simply ignored. I had to file the last document 9 times before the court finally docketed it. I think that's because the case was dismissed, but who knows? In 800 years of Anglo-American jurisprudence, has anyone else needed years of litigation to decide personal jurisdiction at the trial court level and without discovery? I don't know. Has there been? Also, it looks like the 800 years would bring us back to 1225, and that was when the Magna Carta was reissued. I don't know what that's got to do with this case, but, you know, I think that's what she's talking about. She continues. In 800 years of Anglo-American jurisprudence, has anyone else held that an employment agreement cannot be enforced in the jurisdiction in which it was made? Once again, I don't know, maybe. But I think it may be because they didn't have cell phones in 1225. But I don't know. I'm not a historian. In other words, this case is completely unprecedented in recorded human history. And then in parentheses it says, by law and custom, all alleged precedent prior to the arrival of the Black Death in England is disregarded as inherently unreliable. I have no idea what's going on here. Why are we talking about the Magna Carta and the Black Death? Are they alleging that before the Black Death, there may have been a case in which someone was sued in a state in which they weren't hired? I don't know. Maybe they're showing off. Who knows? Who can guess what's going on right now? Okay, so they're continuing the sentence. This case is completely unprecedented. Or, you're lying and discriminating against me. If it's the former, wouldn't discovery help resolve a case without parallel? If it is the latter, you must go. Quite simply, it's an absolute disgrace that we're in the third year of a case in which you have done absolutely nothing of substance. If you're so busy that you need years to do anything, you should recuse. And the absolutely nothing and years are in bold, all caps, italics. They're really hitting them hard. It then says, regardless, let's get moving, which is a really weird informal tone shift after talking about the Black Plague and the Magna Carta. It continues. It's been 685 days, and you've done absolutely nothing to resolve this case. Meanwhile, key witnesses have died or disappeared. Documents have been lost, but nothing gets done. Once again, all caps, bold, italics. It is getting heated. If I'm right, then what you've done is beyond shameful. If I'm wrong, it's pretty strange that you can't seem to figure out why I'm wrong after 685 days. Stranger still, that all anybody can muster in your defense is that you haven't proved you're a liar and a bigot beyond any doubt. Well, that's certainly reassuring. Everybody is comforted to know that federal judges may be liars and bigots, but there's still some doubt about it. I suppose as long as there's a chance they're honest and non-bigoted, we can all sleep well at night. Which is brutal. They should write a diss track. To borrow a phrase, have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you no sense of decency? And this phrase is famous in that it's considered the phrase that took down Senator McCarthy of Red Scare infamy, the anti-communist stuff. How can you continue in a case in which the best that can be said about your performance is that it leaves neutral federal appellate court judges with some doubt regarding your dishonesty and bigotry? That they think you might be innocent? How is that good enough for you? For anyone? So I'm going to read between the lines a little bit here, and I think that this is a misleading interpretation. What they say in court is evidence like beyond a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond shadow of a doubt. But this is just kind of court speak / law speak. It doesn't mean that the other judges think he might be dishonest. They just need some proof of dishonesty and they don't have any. Kind of as an example, a similar example, when they read the verdicts in court cases, they say guilty and not guilty. They don't say guilty and innocent. And that's because the defendant doesn't have to prove that they're innocent. They just have to prove there's not enough evidence to say they're guilty. That's just how the law and the courts talk about the evidence and the verdict. It's just jargon. So I don't know for sure, but to me, this could be what is going on. The judges just said, like, they use the typical terminology they use to say there's no evidence, and then it's kind of a misleading conclusion of what that means. You've handled this case in such a careless and slipshod manner that you didn't even bother to listen to the defendant's board meetings that unambiguously resolve all the factual issues in this case. Because why use facts when you can do nothing instead? Careless and slipshod. So they end this letter by saying that the judge should transfer the case to where he thinks it's appropriate. I'm not sure if judges are supposed to do that or if the pages have to refile in a different state. I don't know how that works. But again, they say that it is respectfully submitted, so all good, I guess. No harm done. And we just have one more letter for now, unfortunately. This is the 10th motion to recuse from Page to the judge, and it's from January 2026, so very recently. They're still arguing about jurisdiction and about recusing the judge. This one does get a little bit more complicated than the others. So for background, Page said that DB&A knew she would be living and working in New York City. The judge said there was no evidence of that. He cited a similar case in which the employee and the employer agreed that this person could work in New York and specifically could work in Brooklyn. And they ruled that the case could be handled in New York courts, even if the company wasn't in New York. So I think the Pages are citing this case to say, look, as precedent, we can sue in New York because this other person did. But the judge says, Page offers no support for the notion that DB&A, quote, hired her knowing that she would live and work in New York, unquote. So these quotes right here are a kind of a direct quote from the prior case. So it's cited to this prior case. So in this prior case, The company did know the person was working remotely in New York, so they were allowed to sue in New York. When the judge cites this case, he put New York in brackets. It originally said Brooklyn in the other case, and Brooklyn is in New York. Brackets are an accepted way to kind of change a quote a little bit to make it flow more seamlessly or make it make sense in your sentence. So it's like allowed as long as you put the brackets to change some things, as long as it doesn't meaningfully change the content of the sentence. But the pages did not like this substitution of Brooklyn for New York. In a response to the quote, the pages say, "This is a brazenly fraudulent citation. The actual citation says, defendants hired her knowing that she would live and work in Brooklyn," which is what I just explained. "Thus, you simply lied. You can't replace the word Brooklyn with the words New York without conceding the parties are deemed to know that Brooklyn is in New York, whether they actually know that Brooklyn is in New York or not. Are we really supposed to believe that people are deemed to know that Brooklyn is in New York, but are free to feign ignorance of the fact that Queens is in New York? Because Queens, Ohio is so famous." I don't know what's going on here. So from my interpretation, which may be very wrong, the judge is saying there's no physical evidence that DB&A knew Paige was working in New York, that Paige needed to show them a company letter that was sent to her house, or that her New York address was filed. So the Pages did live and work in Queens at some point. Queens is also in New York. So I think that they're misinterpreting what the judge is saying, because I think the judge is saying there's no physical evidence. The only evidence we have that DB&A knew about Paige being in New York is just Michelle Page says so, and that's not enough evidence. The Pages seem to be conflating that with DB&A knew she was in Queens and was working from Queens, but didn't know that Queens was in New York. But that's not how I interpreted the original. But I do think it's funny that they say, like, which cities would non-New Yorkers know are in New York? And is Queens on the wrong side of that line? And it's like, yeah, kind of. Brooklyn is a lot more well known than Queens. Like Brooklyn and Manhattan, and then probably Queens. So kind of, yeah. I don't know. Anyway, continuing on. Long and short, you lied. You willfully, deliberately, and maliciously doctored a quote to force it to say the opposite of what it actually says. And you further doctored the quote to omit the part that specifically stated imputed knowledge plus communication is sufficient for jurisdiction. Gee, I wonder why. I'm not tracking on this argument. I just like the rhetorical questions. Because the only evidence of the defendant's knowledge in the case that you cited was the defendant's phone calls and emails. The very evidence that you deemed insufficient in this case! Exclamation point. So maybe I'm wrong and there is similar evidence between the two cases. I don't have any of it to be able to see and make my own decision. But I will note that the previous case was in 2014. So it is much, much, much less expected that someone would be working from home then. So it just kind of like the assumptions may be a little bit different pre and post COVID. I don't know. They continue. Thus, you are a liar and not a very good one. You must be recused. And contrary to your claims, there's never been any suggestion that your lies and sexist statements made in this case at issue are thereby immunized or inadmissible or insufficient. This isn't about any substantive disagreement. This is about your lies and your constant reference to me using sexist slurs and your decisions to rule based upon those sexist slurs, even assuming arguendo that you didn't intend or understand your sexist slurs. Yeah, I don't know what this is about. I don't know what sexist slurs she's talking about in this case in particular. I've only seen it in the Lerner Fund case, and then the Lerner Fund case was referenced in the bankruptcy case, and in the Skytop case, and then in the Dragon Curve case. But for this one, I haven't seen anything of it. Maybe it exists. Or she's speaking in hyperbole, which has a noted precedent. So at the end of all these letters, there's just a little stamp from the judge that says he denies the motion to recuse. So it seems like the court isn't open to revisit this. But good news. In one of the letters, she says, "The Second Circuit required me to exhaust my alternatives, so I will continue exhausting them until I can file another petition." Which means she's gonna keep going. And I selfishly hope they keep going forever. I love reading them, and it brings me so much joy. So I will keep an eye out for anything new. And remember, always get a written contract before you start working for a company. Until next time. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host. The podcast is intended for general information and entertainment purposes only. The content provided is based on publicly available records. The podcast, host, and creators make no accusations, implications, or charges of any crime, wrongdoing, or unethical behavior whatsoever. The host has little to no knowledge of justice system norms, and any opinions stated are for the purposes of humor only. Please do not contact anyone mentioned in the podcast.